Welcome back, one and all, to Witches. We are nearing the end of our tale, but before we do get to more story, we need to review what we have learned so far in The Witches by Roald Dahl. So, as I have begun other chapters, I want you to remember something. Think about what are the ways we can tell someone is a witch. Then, let's go through our story. Quick review. Our main character and his grandmama are on a little trip to a hotel. Our main character is a little boy who has learned all about witches from his grandmother. She has tried hunting witches and she knows all about them. Well, at this hotel, our main character finds the witches of England in their annual meeting. Hundreds and hundreds of these terrifying creatures are here in the hotel that they are staying in. The most evilest and horriblest of them all is the Grand High Witch. She comes to this meeting with a brilliant idea to get rid of what witches hate most: children. Uh-oh. So, her brilliant idea is a potion that turns children into mice. Ugh. They just put one drop into a sweet and give it to the children. Not good. Well, our main character is hiding in the back of the room during this meeting and hears everything, sees everything, and also sees a boy named Bruno Jenkins get turned into a mouse. Well, we think our main character might just get away, but then at the end of the meeting, they sniff him out. They smell this small boy and capture him. Do you know what they do to him? Do you remember? They turn him into a mouse. Oh boy. Well, he and Bruno Jenkins make it back up to our main character's grandmother's room. Luckily, she understands and is very willing to still take care of her little grandson as a mouse. Luckily, our main character and Bruno both keep their mind and their voices. So, our main character comes up with a brilliant idea. He remembers that the Grand High Witch's room is right below his in the hotel. So, he is going to be lowered down and steal some of that potion from her room. What they're going to do with it is put it in the witch's food and turn all of them into mice. Ha ha! But first, they have to pull this off. So, let's get back to our question. What are the ways that you can tell someone is a witch? Do you remember? First, they're always wearing gloves because they have claws for hands. And they're always itching their heads because they are bald and so they have to wear a wig and it makes their heads really itchy and rashy. They also have no toes. None, no toes. So maybe they walk a little funny in their shoes because they're really uncomfortable. They have giant nostrils to sniff out children. And their pupils, you can't see them. It looks like fire and ice, and it's scary. Whew. Well, sadly, our main character has seen all of that in action and now is preparing with his grandmama to set out on their quest to get some of this potion from the Grand High Witch's room. Let's see if they succeed. Chapter 15. The Mouse Burglar. My grandmother hustled me back into my own bedroom and out onto the balcony. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I'm going to put you in the sock now." "I hope I can manage this," I said. "I'm only a little mouse." "You'll manage," she said. "Good luck, my darling." She popped me into the sock and started lowering me over the balcony. I crouched inside the sock and held my breath. Through the stitches, I could see out quite clearly. Miles below me, children were playing on the beach, and they were the size of beetles. The socks started swinging in the breeze. I looked up and saw my grandmother's head sticking out over the railings of the balcony above. "You're nearly there," she called out. "Here we go. Gently does it. You're down." I felt a slight bump. "In you go," my grandmother was shouting. "Hurry, hurry, hurry. Search the room." I jumped out of the sock and ran into the Grand High Witch's bedroom. There was the same musty smell about the place that I had noticed in the ballroom. It was the stench of witches. It reminded me of the smell inside the men's public lavatory at our local railway station. As far as I could see, the room was tidy enough. There was no sign anywhere that it was inhabited by anyone but an ordinary person. But then there wouldn't be, would there? No witch would be stupid enough to leave anything suspicious lying around for the hotel maid to see. Suddenly, I saw a frog jumping across the carpet and disappearing under the bed. I jumped myself. "Hurry up!" came my grandmother's voice from somewhere high up outside. "Grab the stuff and get out!" I started skittering round and trying to search the room. It wasn't so easy. I couldn't, for example, open any drawers. I couldn't open the doors of the big wardrobe either. I stopped skittering about. I sat in the middle of the floor and had to think. If the Grand High Witch wanted to hide something top secret, where would she put it? Certainly not in an ordinary drawer. Not in the wardrobe either. It was too obvious. I jumped up onto the bed to get a better view of the room. Hey, I thought, what about under the mattress? Very carefully, I lowered myself over the edge of the bed and wormed my way underneath the mattress. I had to push forward hard to make headway. But I kept at it. I couldn't see a thing. I was scrambling about under the mattress when my head suddenly bumped against something hard inside the mattress above me. I reached up and felt it with my paw. Could it be a little bottle? It was a little bottle. I could trace the shape of it along the cloth of the mattress. And right alongside it, I felt another hard lump, and another, and another. The Grand High Witch must have split open the mattress and put all the bottles inside, then sewn it all up again. I began tearing away frantically at the mattress cloth above my head with my teeth. My front teeth were extremely sharp, and it didn't take me long to make a small hole. I climbed into the hole and grabbed the bottle by the neck. I pushed it down through the hole in the mattress and climbed out after it. Walking backwards and dragging the bottle behind me, I managed to reach the edge of the mattress. I rolled the bottle off the bed onto the carpet. It bounced, but didn't break. I jumped down off the bed. I examined the little bottle. It was identical to the one the Grand High Witch had had in the ballroom. There was a label on this one. Formula 86, it said. Delayed Action Mouse Maker. Then it said, this bottle contains 500 doses. Eureka! I felt tremendously pleased with myself. 3 frogs came hopping out from under the bed. They crouched on the carpet, staring at me with large black eyes. I stared back at them. Those huge eyes were the saddest things I had ever seen. It suddenly occurred to me that almost certainly once upon a time they had been children, those frogs, before the Grand High Witch had got a hold of them. I stood there clutching the bottle, staring at the frogs. "Who are you?" I asked them. At that exact moment, I heard a key turning in the lock of the door, and the door burst open. The Grand High Witch swept into the room. The frogs jumped underneath the bed again in one quick hop. I darted after them, still clutching the bottle, and I ran back against the wall and squeezed in behind one of the bedposts. I heard feet walking on the carpet. I peeped around the bedpost. The 3 frogs were clustered together under the middle of the bed. Frogs cannot hide like mice. They cannot run like mice either. All they can do, poor things, is hop about rather clumsily. Suddenly, the Grand High Witch's face came into view, peering under the bed. I popped back behind the bedpost.
"So there you are, my little froggies," I heard her saying. "You can stay where you are until I go to bed tonight. Then I shall throw you out of the window, and the seagulls can have you for supper."
Suddenly, very loud and clear, there came the sound of my grandmother's voice through the open balcony door.
"Hurry up, my darling," it shouted. "Do hurry up. You better come out quickly."
"Who's calling?" snapped the Grand High Witch. I peeped around the bedpost again and saw her walking across the carpet to the balcony door.
"Who is on my balcony?" she muttered. "Who is it? Who dares to trespass on my balcony?"
She went through the door on the balcony itself.
"What is this knitting wool hanging down here?" I heard her saying.
"Oh, hello," my grandmother's voice came.
"I just dropped my knitting over the balcony by mistake. It's all right. I've got hold of one end of it. I can pull it up myself, thank you all the same."
I marveled at the coolness of her voice.
"Who were you talking to just now?" snapped the Grand High Witch. "Who were you telling to hurry up and come out quickly?" "I was talking to my little grandson," I heard my grandmother saying. "He's been in the bathroom for hours, and it's time he came out. He sits in there reading books, and he forgets completely where he is. Do you have any children, my dear?"
"I do not!" shouted the Grand High Witch, and she came quickly back into the bedroom, slamming the balcony door behind her. I was cooked. My escape route was closed. I was shut up in the room with the Grand High Witch and 3 terrified frogs. I was just as terrified as the frogs. I was quite sure that if I was spotted, I would be caught and thrown over the balcony for the seagulls. There came a knock at the bedroom door.
"What is it this time?"
shouted the Grand High Witch.
"It's we ancient ones," came a meek voice from behind the door. "It's 6 o'clock, and we have come to collect the bottles you promised us, your grandness."
I saw her crossing the carpet toward the door. The door was opened, and then I saw a whole lot of feet and shoes beginning to enter the room. They were coming in slowly and hesitantly, as though the owners of those shoes were frightened of entering.
Come in, snapped the Grand High Witch. "Do not stand there dithering in the corridor. I don't have all night."
I saw my chance. I jumped out from behind the bedpost and ran like lightning towards the open door. I jumped over several pairs of shoes on the way out, and in 3 seconds I was out in the corridor, still clutching my precious bottle to my chest. No one had seen me. There were no shouts of, "Mouse! Mouse!" All I could hear were the voices of the ancient ones burbling their silly sentences about, "Oh, how your grandness is," and all the rest of it. I went scampering down the corridor to the stairs and up one flight. I went to the 5th floor and then along the corridor again until I came to the door of my own bedroom. Thank goodness there was no one in sight. Using the bottom of the little bottle, I began tap, tap, tapping on the door. Tap, tap, tap. I went tap, 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 tap. Would my grandmother hear me? I thought that she must. The bottle made quite a loud tapping when every time it struck. Tap, 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 tap. Just so long as nobody came along the corridor. But the door didn't open. I decided to take a risk. "Grandmama!" I shouted as loudly as I possibly could. "Grandmama, it's me! Let me in!" I heard her feet coming across the carpet and the door opened. I went in like an arrow. "I've done it! I've done it!" I cried, jumping up and down. "I've got it, Grandmama! Look, here it is! I've got a whole bottle of it!" She closed the door. She bent down and picked me up and hugged me. "Oh, my darling," she cried. "Thank heavens you're safe." She took the little bottle from me and read the label aloud. "Formula 86, Delayed Action Mouse Maker," she read. "This bottle contains 500 doses." "You brilliant boy! You're a wonder. You're a marvel. How on earth did you get out of her room?" "I nipped out when the ancient witches were coming in," I told her. "It was all a bit hairy, Grandmama. I wouldn't want to do it again." "I saw her too," my grandmother said. "I know you did, Grandmama. I heard you talking to her. Didn't you think she was absolutely foul?" "She's a murderer," my grandmother said. "She's the most evil woman in the entire world."
Did you see her mask? I asked. It's amazing, my grandmother said. It looks just like a real face. Even though I knew it was a mask, I still couldn't tell. Oh, my darling, she cried, giving me a hug. Thought I'd never see you again. I'm so happy you got away.
Chapter 16. Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins Meet Bruno. My grandmother carried me back to her own bedroom and put me on the table. She set the precious bottle down beside me.
What time are those witches having supper in the dining room? She asked.
8 o'clock, I said. She looked at her watch.
It's now 6:10, she said. We've got until 8 o'clock to work out our next move.
Suddenly, her eyes fell upon Bruno. He was still in the banana bowl on the table. He had eaten 3 bananas and was now attacking a 4th. He had become immensely fat.
That's quite enough,
my grandmother said, lifting him out of the bowl and putting him on the tabletop.
I think it's time we return this little fellow to the bosom of his family. Don't you agree, Bruno?
Bruno scowled at her. I had never seen a mouse scowl before, but he managed it. My parents let me eat as much as I want, he said. I'd rather be with them than with you.
Of course you would, my grandmother said. Do you know where your parents might be at this moment?
They were in the lodge not long ago, I said. I saw them sitting there as we dashed through all along our way up here.
Right, my grandmother said. Let's go and see if they're still there. Do you want to come along? She added, looking at me.
Yes, please, I said.
I shall put you both in my handbag, she said. Keep quiet and stay out of sight. If you must peep out now and again, don't show more than your nose.
Her handbag was a large, bulgy, black leather affair with a tortoise-shell clasp. She picked Bruno and me up and popped us into it.
I shall leave the clasp undone, she said, but be sure to keep out of sight.
I had no intention of keeping out of sight. I wanted to see everything. I seated myself in the little side pocket inside the bag, near the clasp, and from there I was able to poke my head out whenever I wanted to. "Hey," Bruno called out. "Give me the rest of that banana I was eating."
"Oh, all right," my grandmother said. "Anything to keep you quiet."
She dropped the half-eaten banana into the bag, then slung the bag over her arm and marched out of the room and went thumping along the corridor with her walking stick. We went down to the lift in the ground floor and made our way through the reading room to the lounge. And there, sure enough, sat Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins in a couple of armchairs with a low, round, glass-covered table between them. There were several other groups in there as well, but the Jenkinses were the only couple sitting alone. Mr. Jenkins was reading a newspaper. Mrs. Jenkins was knitting something large and mustard-colored. Only my nose and eyes were above the clasp of my grandmother's handbag, but I had a super view. I could see everything. My grandmother, dressed in black lace, went thumping across the floor of the lounge and halted in front of the Jenkinses' table.
"Are you Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins?" she asked.
Mr. Jenkins looked over the top of his newspaper and frowned. "Yes," he said. "I am Mr. Jenkins. What can we do for you, madam?"
"I'm afraid I have some rather alarming news for you," she said. "It's about your son Bruno."
"What about Bruno?" Mr. Jenkins said. Mrs. Jenkins looked up, but went on knitting. "What has that little blighter been up to now?" Mr. Jenkins said. "Raiding the kitchen, I suppose?"
"It's a bit worse than that," my grandmother said. "Do you think we might go somewhere more private while I tell you about it?"
"Private?" Mr. Jenkins said. "Why do we have to be private?"
"It's not an easy thing for me to explain," my grandmother said. "I'd much rather we all went up to your room and sat down before I tell you any more."
Mr. Jenkins lowered his paper. Mrs. Jenkins stopped knitting. "I don't want to go up to my room, madam," Mr. Jenkins said. "I'm quite comfortable here. Thank you very much." He was a large, coarse man, and he wasn't used to being pushed around by anybody. "Kindly state your business, and then leave us alone," he added. He spoke as though he was addressing someone who was trying to sell him a vacuum cleaner at the back door. My poor grandmother,
who had been doing her best to be as kind as possible, now began to bristle a bit herself. "We really can't talk in here," she said. "There's too many people. This is a rather delicate and personal matter."
"I'll talk where I dashed well want to, madam," Mr. Jenkins said. "Come on now, out with it. If Bruno has broken a window or smashed your spectacles, then I'll pay for the damage, but I'm not budging out of this seat."
One or two other groups in the room were beginning to stare at us now.
"Where is Bruno, anyway?" Mr. Jenkins said. "Tell him to come here and see me."
"He's here already," my grandmother said. "He's in my handbag." She patted the big floppy leather bag with her walking stick.
"What the heck do you mean he's in your handbag?" Mr. Jenkins shouted.
"Are you trying to be funny?" Mrs. Jenkins said, very prim. "There's nothing funny about this," my grandmother said. "Your son has suffered a rather unfortunate mishap."
"He's always suffering mishaps," Mr. Jenkins said. "He suffers from overeating, then he suffers from wind. You should hear him suffer."
Oops.
"You should hear him after supper. Sounds like a brass band. But a good dose of castor oil soon puts him right again. Where is the little bugger?"
"I've already told you," my grandmother said. "He's in my handbag, but I do think it might be better if we went somewhere private before you meet him in his present state." "This woman's mad," Miss Jenkins said. "Tell her to go away." "The plain fact is," my grandmother said, "that your son Bruno has been rather drastically altered."
"Altered?" shouted Mr. Jenkins. "What the devil do you mean, altered?"
"Go away," Mrs. Jenkins said. "You're a silly old woman." "I'm trying to tell you as gently as I possibly can that Bruno really is in my handbag," my grandmother said. "My own grandson actually saw them doing it to him."
"Saw who doing what to him, for heaven's sake?" shouted Mr. Jenkins. He had a black mustache which jumped up and down when he shouted.
"Saw the witches turning him into a mouse," my grandmother said. "Call the manager, dear," Mrs. Jenkins said to her husband. "Have this mad woman thrown out of the hotel." At this point, my grandmother's patience came to an end. She fished around in her handbag and found Bruno. She lifted him out and dumped him on the glass-topped table. Mrs. Jenkins took one look at the fat little brown mouse, who was still chewing a bit of banana, and she let out a shriek that rattled the crystals of the chandelier. She sprang out of her chair, yelling, "It's a mouse! Take it away! I can't stand the things!" "It's Bruno," my grandmother said.
"You nasty, cheeky old woman!"
shouted Mr. Jenkins. He started flapping his newspaper at Bruno, trying to sweep him off the table. My grandmother rushed forward and managed to grab hold of him before he was swept away. Mrs. Jenkins was still screaming her head off, and Mr. Jenkins was towering over us, shouting,
"Get out of here! How dare you frighten my wife like that? Take your filthy mouse away this instant!"
"Help!" screamed Mrs. Jenkins. Her face had gone the color of the underside of a fish. "Well, I did my best," my grandmother said, and with that she turned and sailed out of the room, carrying Bruno with her. Chapter 17. The Plan. When we got back to the bedroom, my grandmother took both me and Bruno out of her handbag and put us on the table. "Why on earth didn't you speak up and tell your father who you were?" she said to Bruno.
"Because I'm a mouthful,"
Bruno said. He jumped straight back into the bowl of bananas and went on with his eating. "What a very disagreeable little boy you are," my grandmother said to him. "Not a boy," I said. "Mouse." "Quite right, my darling. But we don't have time to worry about him at this moment. We have plans to make. In about an hour and a half's time, all the witches will be going down to supper in the dining room, right?" "Right," I said. "And every one of them has got to be given a dose of the mouse maker?" she said. "How on earth are you going to do that?" Grandmama, I said, I think you are forgetting that a mouse can go places where human beings can't.
That's quite right, she said. But even a mouse can't go creeping around on the tabletop carrying a bottle and sprinkling mouse maker all over the witch's roast beef without being spotted.
I wasn't thinking of doing it in the dining room, I said.
And where? She said.
In the kitchen, I said, while the food is being got ready. My grandmother stared at me.
My darling child, she said slowly, I do believe that turning you into a mouse has doubled your brain power.
A little mouse, I said, can go scuttling around the kitchen along the pots and pans, and if he's very careful, no one will ever see him.
Brilliant, my grandmother cried out. By golly, I think you've got it.
The only thing is, I said, how will I know which food is theirs? I don't want to put it in the wrong saucepan. It would be disastrous if I turned all the other guests into mice by mistake, especially you, Grandmama.
Then you'll just have to creep into the kitchen and find a good hiding place and wait and listen. Just lie there in some dark cranny listening to what the cooks are saying. And then, with a bit of luck, someone's going to give you a clue. Whenever they have a very big party to cook for, the food is always prepared separately.
Right, I said. That's what I'll have to do. I shall wait there and I shall listen and I shall hope for a bit of luck.
It's going to be very dangerous, my grandmother said. Nobody welcomes a mouse in the kitchen. If they see you, they'll squish you to death.
I won't let them see me, I said.
Don't forget you'll be carrying the bottle, she said, so you won't be nearly so quick and nippy.
I can run quite fast standing up with the bottle in my arms, I said. I did it just now, don't you remember? I came all the way up from the Grand High Witch's room carrying it.
What about the unscrewing at the top? She said. That might be difficult for you.
Let me try, I said. I took hold of the little bottle, and using both of my front paws, I found I was able to unscrew the cap quite easily.
That's great, my grandmother said. You really are a very clever mouse. She glanced at her watch. At 7:30, she said, I shall go down to the dining room for supper with you in my handbag. I shall then release you under the table together with the precious little bottle from then, and you'll be on your own. You will have to work your way unseen across the dining room to the door that leads to the kitchen. There will be waiters going in and out of that door all the time. You will have to choose the right moment and nip in behind one of them. But for heaven's sake, be sure you don't get trodden on or squeezed in the door.
I'll try not to, I said.
Whatever happens, you mustn't let them catch you.
Don't go on about it, Grandma. You're making me nervous.
You're a brave little fellow, she said. I do love you.
What shall we do with Bruno? I asked her.
Bruno looked up. I'm coming with you, he said, speaking with his mouth full of banana. I'm not going to miss my supper. My grandmother considered this for a moment. I'll take you along, she said, if you promise to stay in my bag and keep absolutely silent. Will you pass food down to me from the table? Bruno asked. Yes, she said, if you promise to behave yourself. Would you like something to eat, my darling? She asked me.
No, thank you, I said. Too excited to eat, and I've got to keep fit and frisky for the big job ahead.
It is a big job, all right, my grandmother said. You'll never do a bigger one.
Chapter 18. In the Kitchen.
The time has come, my grandmother said. The great moment has arrived. Are you ready, my darling?
It was exactly 7:30. Bruno was in the bowl finishing that fourth banana.
Hang on, he said. Just a few more bites. No, my grandmother said. We've got to go.
She picked him up and held him tight in her hand. She was very tense and nervous. I'd never seen her like that before.
I'm going to put you both in my handbag now, she said, but I shall leave the clasp undone.
She popped Bruno into first, and I waited, clutching the little bottle to my chest.
Now you,
she said. She picked me up and gave me a kiss on the nose.
Good luck, my darling. Oh, by the way, you do realize you've got a tail, don't you?
A what? I said. "A tail, a long curly tail." "I must say, that had never occurred to me," I said. "Good gracious me, so I have. I can see it now. I can actually move it. It is rather grand, isn't it?" "I mention it only because it might come in useful when you're climbing about in the kitchen," my grandmother said. "You can curl it around and you can hook it on things, and you can swing from it and lower yourself to the ground from high places." "I wish I'd known this before," I said. "Could have practiced using it." "It's too late now," my grandmother said. "We've got to go." She popped me in her handbag with Bruno, and at once I took my usual perch in the small side pocket so that I could poke my head out and see what was going on. My grandmother picked up her walking stick, and out she went into the corridor to the lift. She pressed the button, and the lift came up, and she got in. There was no one in there with us. "Listen," she said, "I won't be able to talk to you much once we're in the dining room. If I do, people will think I'm dotty and talking to myself." The lift reached the ground floor and stopped with a jerk. My grandmother walked out of it and crossed the lobby of the hotel and entered the dining room. It was a huge room with gold decorations on the ceiling and big mirrors all around the walls. The regular guests always had their tables reserved for them, and most of them were already in their places and starting to eat their suppers. Waiters were buzzing about all over the place, carrying plates and dishes. Our table was a small one beside the right-hand wall, about halfway down the room. My grandmother made her way to it and sat down. Peeping out of the handbag, I could see in the very center of the room 2 long tables that were not yet occupied. Each of them carried a notice fixed on a sort of silver stick, and the notices said, "Reserved for members of the RSPCC." My grandmother looked toward the long tables, but said nothing. She unfolded her napkin and spread it out over her handbag on her lap. Her hand slid under the napkin and took hold of me gently. With the napkin covering me, she lifted me up close to her face and whispered, "I'm about to put you on the floor under the table. The tablecloth reaches almost the ground, so no one will see you. Have you got the bottle?" "Yes," I whispered back. "I'm ready, Grandmama." Just then, a waiter in a black suit came and stood by our table. I could see his legs from under the napkin, and as soon as I heard his voice, I knew who he was. His name was William. "Good evening, madam," he said to my grandmother. "Where is the little gentleman tonight?" "He's not feeling well," my grandmother said. "He's staying in his room." "I'm sorry to hear that," William said. "Today there is green pea soup to start with, and for the main course we have a choice of either grilled fillet or sole or roast lamb." "Pea soup and lamb for me, please," my grandmother said. "But don't hurry it, William. I'm in no rush tonight. In fact, you can bring me a glass of dried sherry first." "Of course, madam," William said, and he went away. My grandmother pretended she had dropped something, and as she bent down, she slid me out from under the napkin onto the floor under the table. "Go, darling, go," she whispered, then straightened back up again. I was on my own now. I stood clasping the bottle. I knew exactly where the door into the kitchen was. I had to go about halfway around the enormous dining room to reach it. Here goes, I thought, and like a flash I skidded out from under the table and made for the wall. I had no intention of going across the dining room floor. It was far too risky. My plan was to cling close to the skirting of the wall all the way around until I reached the kitchen door. I ran. Oh, how I ran. I don't think anyone saw me. They were all too busy eating. But to reach the door leading to the kitchen, I had to cross the main entrance of the dining room. I was about to do this when in poured a great flood of females. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the bottle. At first, I saw only the shoes and ankles of these women who were surging in through the door, but when I glanced up a bit higher, I knew at once who they were. They were the witches coming in to dinner. I waited until they all passed me by. Then I dashed on towards the kitchen door. A waiter opened it to go in. I nipped in after him and hid behind a big garbage bin on the floor. I stayed there for several minutes, just listening to all the talk and the racket. By golly, what a place that kitchen was. The noise and the steam and the clatter of pots and pans. and the cooks all shouting, and the waiters all rushing in and out from the dining room, yelling the food orders to the cooks. 4 soups and 2 lambs and 2 fish for table 28. 3 apple pies and 2 strawberry ice creams for table 17. Stuff like that was going on all the time. Not far above my head, there was a handle sticking out from the side of the garbage bin. Still clutching the bottle, I gave a leap, turned in a somersault in the air, and caught hold of the handle with the end of my tail. Suddenly, there I was, swinging to and fro, upside down. It was terrific. I loved it. This, I told myself, is how a trapeze artist in a circus must feel as he goes swishing through the air high up in a circus tent. The only difference was that his trapeze could only swing backwards and forwards. My trapeze, my tail, could swing me in any direction I wanted. Perhaps I would become a circus mouse after all. Just then, a waiter came in with a plate in his hand and heard him saying, "The old hag on table 14 says this meat is too tough. She wants another portion." One of the cooks said, "Give me a plate." I dropped to the floor and peered around the garbage bin. I saw the cook scrape the meat off the plate and slap another bit on. Then he said, "Come on, boys, give us some gravy." He carried the plate round to everybody in the kitchen. And do you know what they did? Every one of the cooks and the kitchen boys spat on the old lady's plate.
"See how she likes it now,"
said the cook, handing the plate back to the waiter. Quite soon, another waiter came in, and he shouted, "Everyone in the big RSPCC party wants the soup." That's when I started sitting up and taking notice. I was all ears now. I edged a bit further around the garbage bin so I could see everything that was going on in the kitchen. A man with a tall white hat, who must have been the head chef, shouted, "Put the soup for the big party in the large silver soup tureen." I saw the head chef place a huge silver basin on the wooden side bench that ran along the whole length of the kitchen against the opposite wall. "Into the silver basin is where the soup is going," I told myself. "So that's where the stuff in my little bottle must go as well." I noticed that high up near the ceiling, above the side bench, there was a long shelf crammed with saucepans and frying pans. If I could somehow clamber up onto that shelf, I thought, then I've got it made. I shall be directly above the silver basin. But first, I must somehow get across to the other side of the kitchen and then up on the middle shelf. A great idea came to me. Once again, I jumped up and hooked my tail around the handle of the garbage bin. Then, hanging upside down, I began to swing. Higher and higher I swung. I was remembering the trapeze artist in the circus I had seen last Easter, and the way he had gotten to the trapeze to swing higher and higher, and then let go and gone flying in the air. So just at the right moment, at the top of my swing, I let go with my tail and went soaring clear across the kitchen and made the perfect landing on the middle shelf. By golly, I thought, what a marvelous thing a mouse can do, and I'm only a beginner. No one had seen me. They were all far too busy with their pots and pans. From the middle shelf, I somehow managed to shinny up a little water pipe on the corner, and in no time at all, I was up on the very top shelf, just under the ceiling, among all the saucepans and the frying pans. I knew that no one could possibly see me up here. It was a superposition, and I began working my way along the shelf until I was directly above the big empty silver basin that they were going to pour the soup into. I put down my bottle, I unscrewed the top, and crept to the edge of the shelf and quickly poured what was in it straight into the silver basin below. The next moment, one of the cooks came along with a gigantic saucepan of steaming green soup and poured the whole lot into the silver basin. He put the lid on the basin and shouted, "Soup for the big party, ready to go out." Then a waiter arrived and carried the silver basin away. I had done it! Even if I never got back alive to my grandmother, the witches were still going to get the mouse maker. I left the empty bottle behind a large saucepan and began working my way back along the top shelf. It was much easier to move without the bottle. I began using my tail more and more. I swung from one handle to another, to the saucepan of another, and all the way along that top shelf, while far below me cooks and waiters were all bustling about, and the kettles were steaming, and saucepans were sputtering, and pots were boiling, and I thought to myself, "Oh boy, this is the life. What fun it is to be a mouse doing an exciting job like this." I kept right on swinging. I swung most marvelously from handle to handle, and was enjoying myself so much that I completely forgot I was in full view of everyone in the kitchen who might happen to glance upwards. What came next happened so quickly I had no time to save myself. I heard a man's voice yelling, "A mouse! Look at that dirty little mouse!" And I caught a glimpse below me of a white-coated figure in a tall white hat, and then there was a flash of steel as a carving knife whizzed through the air, and there was a shoot of pain in the end of my tail, and suddenly I was falling head first towards the floor. Even as I fell, I knew what had happened. I knew that the tip of my tail had been cut off, and that I was about to crash onto the floor, and everyone in the kitchen would be after me. "A mouse!" they were shouting. "A mouse! A mouse! Catch it quick!" I hit the floor and jumped up and ran for my life. All around me there were big black boots going stamp, 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 and I dodged them, and I ran, twisting and turning and dodging and swerving across the kitchen floor. "Get it!" they were all shouting. "Kill it! Stamp on it!" The whole floor seemed to be full of black boots stamping away at me. And I dodged, I swerved, and I twisted and turned. And then, in sheer desperation, hardly knowing what I was doing, wanting only a place to hide, I ran up the trouser leg of one of the cooks and clung to his sock. "Hey!" shouted the cook. "Jeepers creepers! He's up my trouser! Hold on, boys, I'll get him this time!" The man's hand began slapping at the trouser leg, and now I really was going to get smashed if I didn't move quickly. There was only one way to go, and that was up. I dug my little claws into the hairy skin of the man's leg and scuttled upwards, higher and higher, past the calf, past the knee, and onto his thigh. "Holy smoke!" the man was yelling. "It's gonna go all the way up! It's going right up my leg!" I heard shrieks of laughter coming from the other cooks, but I can promise you, I wasn't laughing myself. I was running for my life. The man's hands were slapping all around me, and he was jumping up and down as though he was standing on hot bricks. And I kept climbing and I kept dodging, and very soon I reached the top of his trouser leg, and there was nowhere else to go. "Help! Help! Help!" the man was screaming. "It's in my knickers! It's running around in my flaming knickers! Get it out! Someone help me to get it out!" "Take off your trousers, you silly slob!" someone else shouted. "Pull down your pants and we'll soon catch him." I was in the middle of the man's trousers now, in the place where the two trouser legs meet and the zip begins. It was dark and awfully hot in there, and I knew I had to keep going. I dashed onward and found the top of the trouser leg. I went down it, and greased lightning came out on the floor at the bottom, and once again I was on the floor. I heard the stupid cook still shouting, "It's in me trousers! Get it out! Somebody please help me and get it out before it bites me!" I caught a flashing glimpse of the entire kitchen staff crowding round him and laughing their heads off, and nobody saw the little brown mouse as it flew across the floor and dived into a sack of potatoes. I burrowed down in among the dirty potatoes and held my breath. The cook must have started taking his trousers right off, because they were shouting, "It's not up there! There's no mouse in there, you silly twerp!" "There was! I saw there was!" the man was shouting back. "You never had a mouse in your trousers! You don't know what it feels like!" The fact that a tiny little creature like me had caused such commotion among a bunch of grown-up men gave me a happy feeling. I couldn't help smiling in spite of the pain in my tail. I stayed there until I was sure that they had forgotten about me. Then I crept out of the potatoes and cautiously poked my tiny head over the edge of the sack. Once again, the kitchen was all bustle, with cooks and waiters rushing about everywhere. I saw the waiter who had come in earlier with the complaint about tough meat coming in again. "Hey, boys," he shouted. "I asked the old hag if the new bit of meat was any better, and she said it was perfectly delicious. She said it was very tasty." I had to get out of that kitchen and back to my grandmother. There was only one way to do this. I must make a dash clear across the floor and out through the door behind one of the waiters. I stayed quite still, waiting for my chance. My tail was hurting terribly. I curled it around so I had to look at it. About 2 inches of it were missing, and it was bleeding quite a lot. There was a waiter loading up a batch of plates full of pink ice cream. He had a plate in each hand and 2 more balanced on each arm. He went towards the door. He pushed it open with his shoulder. I leapt out of the sack of potatoes and went across the kitchen floor to the dining room like a streak of light, and I didn't stop running until I was underneath my grandmother's table. It was lovely to see my grandmother's feet again, in those old-fashioned black shoes with their straps and buttons. I shinnied up one of her legs and landed in her lap. "Hello, Grandmama," I whispered. "I'm back. I did it. I poured it all into their soup." Her hand came down and caressed me. "Well done, darling," she whispered back. "Well done, you. They are at this very moment eating that soup." Suddenly she withdrew her hand. "You're bleeding," she whispered. "My darling, what happened to you?" "One of the cooks cut off my tail with a carving knife," I whispered back. "It hurts like billy-o." "Let me have a look at it," she said. She bent her head and examined my tail. "You poor little thing," she whispered. "I'm going to bandage it up with my handkerchief. That'll stop the bleeding." She fished a small lace-edged handkerchief out of her bag, and this she somehow managed to wrap around the end of my tail. "You'll be all right now," she said. "Just try to forget about it." "Did you really manage to pour the whole bottle into their soup?" "Every drop," I said. "Do you think you could put me where I can watch them?" "Yes," she answered. "My handbag is on your empty chair beside me. I'm going to pop you in there now, and you can peep out as long as you are careful not to be seen. Bruno is in there as well, but take no notice of him. I gave him a roll to eat, and that's been keeping him busy for a while." Her hand crossed around me, and I was lifted off her lap and transferred to the handbag. "Hello, Bruno," I said. "This is a great roll," he said, nibbling away in the bottom of the bag. "But I wish there was butter on it." I peered over the top of the handbag. I could see the witches quite clearly, sitting at their 2 long tables in the center of the room. They had finished their soup now, and the waiters were clearing away the plates. My grandmother had lit up one of her disgusting black cigars and was puffing smoke over everything. All around us, the summer holiday guests in their rather grand hotel were babbling away and tucking into their suppers. About half of them were old people with walking sticks, but there were also plenty of families with husbands and wives and several children. They were all well-to-do people. You had to be if you wanted to stay in the Hotel Magnificent. "That's her, Grandmama," I whispered. "That's the Grand High Witch." "I know," my grandmother whispered back. "She's the tiny one in the black, sitting at the head of the nearest table." "She could kill you," I whispered. "She could kill any one of us in this room with her white-hot sparks." "Look out," my grandmother whispered. "The waiter's coming." I popped down out of sight and heard William saying, "Your roast lamb, madam. And which vegetable would you like, peas or carrots?" "Carrots, please," my grandmother said, "but no potatoes." I heard the carrots being dished out. There was a pause. Then my grandmother's voice was whispering, "It's all right, he's gone." I popped my head up again. "Surely no one will notice my little head sticking out like this," I whispered. "No," she answered. "I don't suppose they will. My problem is I've got to talk to you without moving my lips." "You're doing beautifully," I said. "I've counted the witches," she said. "There aren't nearly as many as you thought. You were just guessing, weren't you, when you said 200? "It seemed like 200, I said. "I was wrong too." my grandmother said. I thought there were a lot more witches than this in England. How many are there? I asked. 84, she said. There were 85, I said, but one of them got fired. At that moment, I caught sight of Mr. Jenkins, Bruno's father, heading straight for our table. Look out, Grandmama, I whispered. Here comes Bruno's father. All right, let's discuss the chapters we just read in Witches. In chapter 15, The Mouse Burglar, where would you hide a small bottle in a hotel room? So, the Grand High Witch literally cut open the mattress, stuffed them in, and then sewed it back up. I mean, a lot of hotels have safes, but that's very obvious. I don't know. Between the mattresses? I don't know. Luckily, I've never had to hide something. Our main character feels certain he knows who the frogs are. Do you think he's right? He thinks the frogs used to be kids. Do you think he's right? His children are the thing that the witches hate most, right? And so it's probably what the Grand High Witch did to those poor kids. Turned them into frogs. Our main character got out safely with the potion. Do you think you would have made it without getting squished by all the witch's feet? He is lucky he is speedy, right? They made it back up to his grandmother's room, and they have it. All right, in chapter 16, Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins meet Bruno. How do you think Bruno's parents would react to him being a mouse? What did you think? After hearing what Bruno said about them, I didn't expect much less. They didn't believe her, and when Bruno's mom saw the mouse, she screamed. She was terrified. Do you think Grandmama would try again to take Bruno to his parents? I think that if Bruno asked, she would do it. She's a pretty bold lady. I like it. Also, would you have been upset with Bruno that he didn't say anything? Do you remember what he said, why you didn't talk to him? His mouth was full. Oy. All right, chapter 17 was the plan. Do you think that this plan is going to work? What is their plan? So, they have the potion. What are they going to do with it? They're going to pour the potion into the witch's food because there's enough for 500 doses. And if they all get it really quickly, they'll just turn into mice right away, right? Their plan is to go down a little bit earlier than the witches, because the witches are coming at what time? Do you remember? 8 o'clock. So they're going to go down a little earlier, and he's going to sneak into the kitchen and figure out exactly what their food is, and then pour the potion in. What could go wrong? If you had a mouse in your house, where is the last place you want it? In the kitchen. So if he's spotted, it's gonna be bad. Whew, I hope he makes it. In our next chapter, chapter 18, it's called In the Kitchen. The long tables are reserved for someone. Do you remember what the witches pretended to be members of? The Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Took me a little while to get the RSPCC or whatever. With all the noise in the kitchen, Did you think that our main character will hear the cooks talk about what the witches are going to be eating? That was my worry when he when he came in and it was so loud. He said, how is he going to find what he's looking for? Don't want him to accidentally poison somebody else, right? Turn them into mice. If you were turned into a little mouse, do you think you would have swung around like our main character did all the time with his little tail? I think it would be fun, but I would definitely not be that brave. He's bold, isn't he? But his boldness almost got him in huge trouble. What happened? The cooks and the waiters saw him swinging all over the place, and they cut off a little bit of his tail. Oh, poor guy. But he made it. And he got the whole potion into the witch's soup. So, we will have to see in our next chapter what's going to happen. I can't wait to see as we finish up Witches by Roald Dahl. Bye, everyone.